The day I discovered our HOA had been stealing money from us for over 5 years, I was in the middle of making dinner. My phone buzzed with an email that would change everything. It was a mistakenly sent financial report showing thousands of dollars from our community account were being used to pay for someone else's mortgage. Someone on the board was getting rich while we struggled to keep our neighborhood from falling apart. I honestly don't know if I should even share this story. What happened to my family and our entire neighborhood still makes my blood boil, and some of you might think what we did for payback went too far. But when you're backed into a corner and watching people abuse their power to drain your hard-earned money for years, well, you'll understand why we had to fight back the way we did. Before I get into all the details, I want to be clear. I used to be one of those people who thought HOA horror stories were exaggerated. I'd roll my eyes when neighbors complained about getting fined for their grass being half an inch too tall. I actually volunteered for our neighborhood committee thinking I could help make things better. That was before I uncovered the massive fraud that had been happening right under our noses for years. It all started 3 years ago when we moved into what we thought was our dream home. A beautiful 4-bedroom house in a planned community with well-maintained common areas, a community pool, and monthly HOA fees that seemed reasonable for what we were getting. My husband Mark and I had saved for years to afford this place, and with our 2 kids, Emma and Tyler, we were excited to be part of a real community. The first year was great. We made friends with the neighbors, participated in community events, and even though there were occasional disagreements about HOA rules, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The board president, Linda Wilson, seemed strict but professional. She'd been running the HOA for nearly 8 years, and most people respected her even if they didn't particularly like her. Her right-hand woman was the treasurer, Patricia Miller, who handled all the financial aspects of our community. Things started to change during our second year. The community pool that was supposed to be open from May through September suddenly had maintenance issues and opened 2 months late. The landscaping and common areas began to look neglected. When residents asked questions at the monthly meetings, Linda and Patricia would give vague answers about budget constraints and unexpected expenses. Then came the special assessment. One morning, every homeowner received a letter explaining that due to unforeseen structural issues with the community clubhouse, each household would need to pay an additional $1,500 within 60 days. For many families, including ours, this was a serious financial burden. Mark had just switched jobs and taken a slight pay cut for better work-life balance, and I was working part-time so I could be home when the kids returned from school. "We can't afford this right now," Mark said, looking defeated as he showed me the letter. "We're already stretching our budget thin with the regular HOA fees." I decided to attend the emergency meeting that had been scheduled to discuss the assessment. The clubhouse was packed with angry homeowners, all demanding answers. "Where is the detailed breakdown of these costs?" asked Mr. Rodriguez, an engineer who lived down the street from us. "I'd like to see the inspection report and contractor quotes." Linda stood at the podium, her face a mask of controlled irritation. "The board has reviewed all the necessary documentation and determined this is the most cost-effective solution. We don't need to share every detail with the community." Patricia nodded in agreement. "The bylaws give us the authority to make these decisions and levy special assessments when necessary. I understand it's a financial burden, but we all need to contribute to maintain property values." Something about their dismissive attitude bothered me deeply. After the meeting, I approached a few other homeowners who seemed equally concerned. "This doesn't feel right," said Sarah, a single mom who lived across the street. "My cousin works in construction, and even a major repair to a building this size shouldn't cost that much. They've been running this place like their personal kingdom for years," added Tom, an older gentleman who was one of the original homeowners. "Nobody ever sees the financial statements anymore. They stopped publishing them 2 years ago. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Tom had said about the financial statements. As homeowners and HOA members, didn't we have a right to see where our money was going? The next morning, I emailed Patricia requesting copies of the HOA's financial records for the past 3 years. 3 days passed with no response. I sent another email, nothing. Finally, I called her. "Oh, I've been meaning to get back to you," Patricia said, sounding annoyed. "Those records are only available to board members due to privacy concerns. If you want to run for the board next election, you're welcome to do so." "That's not true," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The bylaws state that financial records must be made available to any homeowner upon request." There was a long pause. "Fine, I'll have something for you next week," she said and hung up. Next week came and went. Nothing. I sent more emails, made more calls. Each time Patricia had a new excuse. She was busy. The records were with the accountant. She was dealing with a family emergency. It was becoming obvious she was stonewalling me. During this time, I started talking to more neighbors and discovered I wasn't the only one with concerns. Several people had requested maintenance that never happened, despite paying their fees. Others had noticed the decreasing quality of community services while our fees had actually increased by 15% over the past 3 years. 2 months after my initial request, I received an email from Patricia with a PDF attached. "Here are the financial summaries for the requested periods," the email read. The document was a joke. Just 3 pages showing total income and expenditures with vague categories like maintenance, administrative costs, and professional services. No details, no itemized expenses, nothing that would explain where our money was actually going. I was about to give up when fate intervened in the strangest way. My neighbor Dave, who worked in IT, was helping me set up a new router when my email dinged with a message from Patricia. But this wasn't meant for me. It was clearly sent to my email address by mistake. A forwarded message containing a complete financial report that had been prepared for the board's eyes only. "Don't open that," Dave said jokingly. "Patricia will claim attorney-client privilege or something." But I had already clicked on it, and what I saw made my heart race. The detailed financial report showed something the summarized version had completely hidden. For the past 5 years, over $12,000 annually had been paid to a company called Wilson Property Management for consulting services. Wilson, the same last name as our board president, Linda. "Dave, look at this," I said, pointing to the screen. "Have you ever heard of the HOA hiring a management company?" Dave shook his head. "We're self-managed. That's why our fees are supposedly lower than neighboring communities." I scrolled through the document, finding more suspicious payments. $5,000 to Miller Landscaping Services, Patricia's last name. And most shocking of all, $24,000 annually labeled as Special Projects Fund, with no further explanation. "This is theft," Dave whispered. "They're stealing from all of us." The revelation hit me like a truck. Our board president and treasurer had been funneling community funds to their own companies and possibly directly into their pockets for years. No wonder the pool wasn't being maintained and the landscaping was neglected. A significant portion of our money was going elsewhere. That night, Mark and I stayed up late discussing what to do. "We need to bring this to the authorities," Mark said. "This is embezzlement, plain and simple." But will anyone care? I wondered. "It's just an HOA. The police might see it as a civil matter." "Then we gather more evidence and take it to the whole community," Mark decided. "They can't silence everyone." The next day, I reached out to Mr. Rodriguez, the engineer, and Tom, the longtime resident. I showed them the financial report, and their reactions mirrored my own shock and anger. "I knew something was off, but this is worse than I imagined," Tom said, shaking his head. "We need to get organized," Mr. Rodriguez added. form a coalition of homeowners and demand answers. If they won't give them, we go to the police or hire a lawyer. Within a week, we had a group of 15 homeowners meeting secretly in my basement. We called ourselves the Community Integrity Committee. Each person took on specific tasks: researching the HOA bylaws, gathering historical financial information, checking county records for Linda and Patricia's businesses, and talking discreetly to other homeowners to gauge support. What we discovered was even more disturbing than I initially thought. Wilson Property Management was registered to Linda's husband, not Linda herself. A poor attempt at hiding the connection. The company had no other clients besides our HOA. Miller Landscaping Services didn't even exist as a registered business. It was just a name on an invoice with payments going directly to Patricia's personal account. Most damning of all, we found that the Special Projects Fund had been used to pay the mortgage on a vacation property in Florida owned jointly by Linda and Patricia. They had literally been using our HOA fees to pay for their beach house. But just as we were preparing to confront the board with our evidence, disaster struck. Patricia sent out a community-wide email announcing that, due to financial irregularities discovered in recent audits, the board had voted to increase monthly HOA fees by 25% effective immediately. Additionally, another special assessment of $2,000 per household would be required to replenish reserve funds. They were trying to cover their tracks by extracting more money from us. And worse, they were blaming it on imaginary irregularities that they themselves had created. That's when I knew this wasn't just about getting justice anymore. This was war. Our Community Integrity Committee expanded overnight. After sharing Patricia's outrageous email with our core group, each member reached out to 5 more homeowners. Within days, we had over 50 people committed to our cause, nearly half the neighborhood. "They're getting desperate," Tom said during our emergency meeting in my garage. We'd outgrown the basement. "They know someone's onto them, so they're grabbing as much cash as they can before it all falls apart. Or they're planning to resign and move to that Florida beach house permanently," added Sarah bitterly. We decided on a 3-pronged approach: legal action, public exposure, and immediate board removal. We each contributed $100 to a fund to hire a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. Jennifer Parks, a committee member who worked in local television, offered to help prepare a media strategy. And Mr. Rodriguez drafted a petition for emergency removal of the current board based on clauses in our community bylaws that addressed malfeasance. But Linda and Patricia weren't going down without a fight. Somehow they learned about our group. The next day, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA's lawyer, whom we were apparently paying for with our fees, threatening me with a lawsuit for defamation, tortious interference, and unauthorized possession of confidential documents. "They're trying to scare you," our lawyer, Mr. Goldstein, said when I forwarded him the letter. "This is a classic intimidation tactic. The financial documents belong to the HOA members, all of you, not just the board. And truth is an absolute defense against defamation." Still, the letter succeeded in frightening some of our supporters. Our next meeting had fewer attendees, and some people stopped responding to our messages altogether. "They're picking us off one by one," I told Mark that night. "People are scared of legal battles and financial ruin." "Then we need to show them that standing together is safer than standing alone," he replied. The next day, I had an idea. I contacted Jennifer from the local news and asked if she could help us create a simple video explaining the situation, using only the facts we could prove from the financial documents. We filmed it in my living room, with me simply explaining what we'd discovered, showing the relevant documents with sensitive information blurred out. Jennifer helped us upload it to YouTube and share it in our community Facebook group. Within hours, it had been viewed by almost everyone in the neighborhood. People who had been on the fence were now messaging me, asking how they could help. The video had accomplished what our private conversations couldn't. It had made the issue impossible to ignore. Then came Linda's response. Rather than addressing the allegations, she sent out an email announcing that the board had voted to place liens on the properties of any homeowners who failed to pay the new increased fees and special assessment. Additionally, they were implementing new community guidelines that restricted gatherings of more than 10 people in private homes without board approval, a transparent attempt to prevent our committee from meeting. Can they even do that? Mark asked, incredulous. Not legally, Mr. Goldstein assured us. The restriction on gatherings is completely unenforceable and likely unconstitutional. As for the liens, they can technically file them, but given the circumstances, we could challenge them in court. But we knew that legal challenges would take time, and meanwhile, people would be pressured into paying money they couldn't afford. We needed to act faster. That's when Sarah came up with a brilliant idea. What if we all put our monthly fees into an escrow account instead of paying the HOA directly? Legally, we're still setting aside the funds, but Linda and Patricia can't access them. Mr. Goldstein confirmed this was a viable strategy. You'll need to formally notify the board that the payments are being held in escrow pending resolution of financial improprieties. I can draft the letter for all participating homeowners to sign. Within a week, 68 households, more than two-thirds of our community, had signed on to the escrow plan. Instead of sending our monthly dues to the HOA account controlled by Patricia, we were depositing them into an account managed by Mr. Goldstein's firm, with transparent reporting to all participants. The response was immediate and furious. Linda called an emergency board meeting, which we all attended en masse. The small clubhouse was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the patio. Linda tried to maintain her composure, but her face was flushed with anger. This illegal withholding of dues is a breach of your contractual obligations as homeowners. Each of you has received a final notice. If payment is not received in full, including late fees by the end of this month, we will begin the lien process, which can ultimately lead to foreclosure. A murmur ran through the crowd. Despite our solidarity, the threat of losing our homes was terrifying. Linda sensed the fear and pressed her advantage. Additionally, we've had to cancel several planned maintenance projects due to this sudden budget shortfall. The pool will remain closed indefinitely, and landscaping services will be reduced to bare minimums. That's when I stood up. Linda, we know about Wilson Property Management and the payments to your husband's company. We know about the non-existent Miller Landscaping Services and the money going straight to Patricia's personal account. And we know about the beach house in Florida being paid for with our HOA dues. The room went completely silent. Linda's face drained of color, and Patricia, sitting beside her, began frantically shuffling papers. "These are false accusations," Linda said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We have the documents," I replied, holding up a folder. "The complete financial records that Patricia accidentally sent to me. We've had forensic accountants review them. We know exactly how much has been taken and where it went." Patricia stood up abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced, grabbing her purse. "No, it isn't," called out Tom from the back. "According to the bylaws, Article 7, Section 3, a meeting can only be adjourned by majority vote or at the scheduled end time. Neither has occurred." Linda and Patricia exchanged panicked looks, then began moving toward the exit. The crowd parted silently, watching them with a mixture of disgust and satisfaction. As they reached the door, two men in suits stepped forward. "Linda Wilson and Patricia Miller," one of them said, showing a badge. "I'm Detective Reynolds with the County Financial Crimes Unit. We'd like to ask you some questions about the management of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association funds." It turned out that Mr. Rodriguez had filed a formal complaint with the police the previous week, providing copies of all our evidence. The detectives had been investigating quietly and had chosen this moment to make their presence known. The room erupted in cheers as Linda and Patricia were escorted out to answer questions. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it was the beginning of justice. Over the next few weeks, our community began the process of healing and rebuilding. An interim board was elected, with Mr. Rodriguez as president and me as treasurer. We implemented new financial controls, including monthly public reporting of all income and expenses, 2 signature requirements for any expenditure over $1,000, and annual audits by an independent accounting firm. The investigation into Linda and Patricia continued, and what they found went beyond even our worst suspicions. The fraud hadn't just been going on for 5 years, it had started almost immediately after Linda became president 8 years ago. The total amount stolen was estimated at over $400,000. They had used our money not just for the beach house, but for luxury cars, expensive vacations, and even college tuition for Patricia's daughter. Both women were eventually charged with multiple felonies, including embezzlement, fraud, and financial exploitation. They accepted plea deals to avoid trial, agreeing to full restitution and serving 2 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. But the money was mostly gone. The beach house had a massive mortgage and little equity. Their other assets had been leased or were heavily financed. In the end, we recovered less than $100,000 of what had been taken. The experience left our community with a financial hole that would take years to fill. But strangely, it also brought us closer together. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now knew each other by name. We organized volunteer days to handle landscaping and minor repairs that we couldn't afford to outsource. The community pool became a symbol of our resilience when we all pitched in to refurbish it ourselves, rather than hiring an expensive contractor. 6 months after the confrontation at the clubhouse, we held a community pool party to celebrate the reopening of our renovated pool. Looking around at all the families enjoying themselves, children splashing in the water, parents chatting in groups, elderly residents watching from the shade, I felt a sense of pride that went beyond just exposing the fraud. "We did more than just catch a couple of thieves," Mark said, echoing my thoughts. "We rebuilt our community." "And made it stronger than it was before," I added. The hard lesson we learned was that governance, even at the HOA level, requires vigilance and participation. When we abdicate our responsibility to stay informed and involved, we create the perfect environment for abuse of power. Linda and Patricia hadn't just stolen our money, they had exploited our apathy and trust. But there was a silver lining to the dark cloud they had cast over our neighborhood. We now had a community of engaged homeowners who understood the value of transparency, accountability, and working together. Our property values, which had dipped slightly during the scandal, were now rising again as word spread about our revitalized community. The following year, when it was time for board elections, we had something unprecedented. Multiple candidates for each position, all presenting detailed platforms and visions for the community. People actually looked forward to HOA meetings, which now included social time before and after the official business. As for Linda and Patricia, we heard they had both been released to halfway houses after 14 months. Model prisoners who taught financial literacy classes to their fellow inmates. An irony not lost on anyone in our community. Neither returned to the neighborhood. Their homes had been sold to pay legal fees and restitution. The most satisfying moment came 3 years after we first discovered the fraud. Our community had not only recovered financially, but had become a model for other HOAs in the region. We'd been featured in the local newspaper as a success story of community governance, and neighboring HOAs had consulted with us on implementing similar transparency measures. I was still serving as treasurer, committed to maintaining the financial integrity we had fought so hard to establish. One afternoon, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Apology." It was from Patricia. "I've been debating whether to write this for months," the email began. "Nothing I can say will undo the damage I caused or excuse my actions. But I want you to know that watching how you all rebuilt what we tried to destroy has affected me deeply. The community you've created is what an HOA should be, neighbors supporting each other instead of living under the thumb of petty tyrants like Linda and me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that what you've accomplished hasn't gone unnoticed, even by someone who tried to prevent it. I showed the email to Mark that evening. "Are you going to respond?" he asked. I thought about it for a long time. The anger I had carried for years had gradually transformed into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that what Patricia and Linda had done no longer defined our community. Yes, I finally decided, not for her sake, but for mine, to close this chapter completely. My reply was brief. "Thank you for your apology. Our community is stronger now because we were forced to fight for it. I hope you found a better path forward." A week later, we held our annual community picnic in the park that we had renovated ourselves after years of neglect. Over 300 residents attended, the largest turnout we'd ever had. As I looked around at children playing on the new playground equipment, teenagers helping elderly neighbors carry plates of food, and dozens of small conversations happening between people who had once been strangers, I realized we had gained something precious from the ordeal. Mr. Rodriguez clinked his glass to get everyone's attention and motioned for me to join him at the front. "3 years ago," he said, "most of us barely knew our neighbors' names. Today, we're not just residents of the same neighborhood, we're a true community. And a lot of that is thanks to one person who refused to be intimidated, who saw something wrong and decided to do something about it." He handed me a plaque that read, "For outstanding service and unwavering integrity." The crowd erupted in applause, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I didn't do it alone," I said when the applause died down. "Every one of you who signed that petition, who put your money in escrow, who showed up to meetings and spoke out, you all did this. We did this together." The sun was setting as the picnic wound down, casting a golden glow over our neighborhood. Children were playing a last game of tag while their parents packed up coolers and folding chairs. Mark put his arm around me as we watched Tyler help an elderly neighbor carry her lawn chair back to her house. "You know what's funny?" he said. "In a weird way, we should almost thank Linda and Patricia." "Thank them?" I asked, surprised. "If they hadn't been so greedy, if they hadn't pushed everyone so far, we might still be a bunch of people living next door to strangers, complaining about HOA fees but never doing anything about it." I nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. Sometimes it takes seeing the worst in people to bring out the best in a community. As we walked home in the fading light, neighbors called out goodbyes and made plans to meet for coffee or dinner later in the week. Our house was the same, our street was the same, but everything else had changed. We had transformed a collection of houses into a neighborhood, a real community where people looked out for each other. The fight had been worth every moment. Looking back on everything now, 5 years after that first accidental email landed in my inbox, I can honestly say that discovering the fraud was one of the best things that ever happened to our community. Not because we enjoyed the struggle or the financial hardship, those were genuinely difficult times, but because it forced us to come together and create something better than what had existed before. Our HOA is now run with complete transparency. Our meetings are well attended, not because people are angry, but because they're invested in their community. Our dues are actually lower than they were during Linda and Patricia's reign, yet we provide more services and maintain our common areas better than ever. Most importantly, we've created a culture where neighbors know and support each other. When the Johnsons' house caught fire last year, they had temporary housing the same day, and donations to replace what they had lost within a week. When Hurricane Marion hit and we lost power for 5 days, those with generators shared their electricity, and we organized a community kitchen in the clubhouse. The lesson I take from all this isn't just about watching for financial fraud or standing up to bullies, though those are important. It's about the power of community and what can happen when people stop being passive consumers of where they live and start being active participants in creating the neighborhood they want. If there's an HOA horror story unfolding in your neighborhood right now, know that you're not powerless. Read your bylaws, talk to your neighbors, demand transparency, and if necessary, fight back. Your home is too important to surrender to those who would abuse their power for personal gain. As for us, we're still here, still vigilant, but also enjoying the fruits of our labor. A true community that began with a mistakenly sent email and ended with a neighborhood transformed. If this story helped you, hit subscribe for more HOA battle stories and victory strategies.